Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. In the name of God, the most compassionate and the most merciful. Greeting of peace to each and every one of you. And welcome to the Singapore Islamic Hub. And most importantly, welcome to the Global Interfaith Leadership Series entitled Deep Learning Across Religious Borders. We are fortunate today to have our distinguished speaker, Professor Francis Xavier Clooney. Distinguished guest, Haji Muhammad Alami Musa, President of Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, Member of Parliament, and not forgetting our speaker, Professor Francis Clooney. Now, to begin the session proper, I would now like to invite Mr. Imran Muhammad Taib, the Director for Center for Interfaith Understanding. But before we begin, we need to acknowledge the co-organizing organization, the S. Rajaratnam School of International Study, Nanyang Technological University of Singapore, Center for Interfaith Understanding, also known as CIFU. This event is also supported by the Harmony Center, Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, the Hindu Endowment Board, and of course not forgetting the Archdiocesan Catholic Council for Interreligious Dialogues. Very mouthful. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Imam Taib to give the opening speech.
Thank you, Ashraf. Distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening. Greetings of peace and salam. I remember many years ago there was great enthusiasm to engage with each other's religion. We learned how to approach the text of another religion and to make comparisons with our own text. We seek each other out in public places as well as in homes. However, we did so in order not to learn and draw profound lessons out of the sacred traditions of the other. Rather, we make comparisons in order to debate, to prove who is right and who is wrong, and to feel good about our own tradition while finding flaws in the other. And sometimes we call it comparative religion. Unfortunately, we are not doing comparative religion. We were simply being polemical at times, to preach, to proselytize. Comparative religion, in its proper sense, is really an academic study of religions, emerging largely in the 19th century, that attempts to yield deeper understanding and appreciation of the phenomenon of religion across the human experience from a comparative aspect. In other words, it produces knowledge and insights from an objective and often detached point of view of different religions. The realization of the need to engage and develop deeper learning on different religions and the religious experience actually predates the 19th century. Just this morning, for example, our distinguished speaker, Professor Francis Clooney, was sharing during a breakfast meeting about a 10th century Muslim scholar Al-Biruni, who translated into Arabic the Yoga Sutras of Pantajali, which was amazing. Yeah? However, comparative study of religion assumes significance only with the onset of the modern world and developed into an urgency with the coming of globalization. With technological advancement in the field of travel and communications, and with an unprecedented human migration around the globe, the religious other, as eloquently put by Wilfred Cantwell Smith, no longer are people, and I quote, peripheral or distant, the ideal curiosities of travelers' tales, and the more alert we are, the more involved in life, the more we are finding that they are our neighbors, our colleagues, our competitors, our fellows. Confucians and Hindus, Buddhists and Muslims are with us not only in the United Nations, but down the street. Increasingly, not only is our civilization's destiny affected by their actions, but we drink coffee with them personally as well, unquote. So I've had many coffee sessions with Buddhists, Hindus, free thinkers even, Christians, and of course, across all the various religious traditions. And we ought to drink more coffee together. So there is a need to know each other in order to live better with each other. But then it is one thing to know about the other. It is another thing to allow that knowledge or understanding to transform us, to confront our own internal sense-making mechanism, to challenge our perspectives on what we have come to regard as truths within our own universe of meaning. This is where perhaps comparative theology can offer some answers, and what better ways than to learn from one of the top scholars, and if I dare say, pioneer in this field, in the contemporary period, which is Professor Francis Xavier Clooney himself. What is comparative theology? I think it's best for the professor to actually explain it himself. But in its most minimalist definition, and I quote, faith-seeking understanding, unquote. It is not primarily about which religion is the true one, but about learning across religious borders in a way that discloses the truth of my faith in the light of their faith. And these are the words of Prof. Clooney himself. Professor Clooney is indeed a leading voice in the scholarly world of interfaith studies, but it is also his optimism that sets him apart from many others. Just 3 years ago, at the height of the global religious conflicts, such as the emergence of ISIS and the refugee crisis, he wrote that, and I quote, interreligious violence and hatred, suspicion, the building of walls, and the exclusion of the stranger are truly not the main forces of our time. Ignorance is not growing stronger all the time. Differences are not becoming insurmountable. Yes, there are terrible problems in our world, and no one should minimize the violence and threats to minorities in certain places. We ought not to merely pretend that all is well. But differences aside, every other tradition too is redefining itself, event by event, conversation by conversation, classroom by classroom, in relation to the religious others, who are now becoming religious collaborators, dialogue partners, and our own friends. The clash of civilization captures the headlines, but the actual reality is that of a growing harmony and understanding that surpasses anything seen on earth up to now, unquote. So those are really very, very optimistic words by Professor. I'm not sure how many of us today shares his optimism, and I'm not sure whether 3 years after he had written this, he has a little bit more pessimism. But we cannot deny that there is much work to be done, particularly in the field of interreligious leadership. Hence, it is apt that Professor Clooney delivers this inaugural public lecture under the Global Interfaith Leadership Program developed by the Center for Interfaith Understanding. Today's lecture is jointly organized with the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, at Nanyang Technological University. And special thanks to Mr. Alami Musa, Head of the Studies in Interreligious Relations in Plural Societies program at RSIS, for his support and partnership. I also like to offer thanks to our supporting partners, the Harmony Center of the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, the Hindu Endowments Board, and the Archdiocesan Catholic Council for Interreligious Dialogue. To proceed, allow me to now invite the moderator of the event, Associate Professor Dr. Yaacob Ibrahim, who is no stranger to many of us and has been an important supporter in fostering interreligious understanding in his former capacity as a minister and also in his current public role. Professor Yaacob is advisor to the president of a new university, the Singapore Institute of Technology, or SIT. He was, of course, former minister in charge of Muslim affairs, and he was in that portfolio during the tumultuous time of post-9/11 world. I invite Professor Yaacob now to welcome and lead the discussion with our distinguished professor at Harvard Divinity School, Father Francis Xavier Clooney. Professor Yaacob, please.
Thank you very much, Imran. Professor Xavier, friends, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to all of you. My task is actually very simple: to introduce the speaker, which I think Imran has done a great job, to moderate the discussion later. But I think most importantly is for us to appreciate what this topic is all about. And I'm not sure whether I did something wrong. I must have. Okay, my apologies, Prof. I've revealed your opening speech. I met Professor Clooney for the first time this morning, actually. We had breakfast for me to gain a better understanding, not just of the topic, but of the man, and interestingly, of the new field called comparative theology. We heard of comparative religion, but I didn't quite understand what comparative theology was all about, and I read some of the papers given to me by Imran of what he has written and his most recent interview. Certainly it's something which I think we can benefit from, his wisdom, for he has now, or he is an expert of two great traditions, Catholicism and Hinduism. And he has used those understanding to inform his own tradition, which I think is an excellent way to develop what we call deep learning across religious borders. Of course, when I see the title Deep Learning, given my other portfolio, I thought it was about artificial intelligence. But clearly, Professor Clooney displays a certain amount of intelligence that none of us can appreciate unless we listen from him, of the amount of work that he has done, and more importantly, the experience that he's gone through to understand what other traditions can inform his own tradition. Right? So he's, as you all know, is a professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School since 2005. And I asked him, what does the SJ means? He says, soft job. That's not true. Society of Jesus, because Professor Xavier is a born Catholic and Jesuit by training since the age of 18. So he's been a Jesuit priest all his life, committed to the religion, but most importantly, committed to build bridges across different traditions. He has written extensively. I will not belabor the point about all his publication, but most importantly, his areas of scholarship is on Indological and theological commentarial writings in Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. And he told us this morning his moment of truth was when he was in a Jesuit school in Nepal, teaching students from various provinces of India and Nepal, and he understood that the Hindu tradition can offer something very different. So as you know, he's a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by the attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning deepened through the study of tradition other than one's own tradition. And of course, he has written extensively, not just on this, but also on the Jesuit mission tradition, particularly in India, and the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation and the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. So with that brief introduction, let me now introduce Professor Xavier for his lecture. Professor, please.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. I feel that in some way we could stop now because the introductions have been so eloquent. I need not say anything more than has already been said. But seriously, I'm very grateful to Imran and Yaacob for their very kind and gracious introductions to this evening, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. The thanks has already been given to the supporting organizations several times, so I will not repeat that. Since this is my first visit to Singapore, I've been here 2 full days now, I look forward to our questions and discussion part of the meeting. So I will try to limit my comments to about 45 minutes and then open it for discussion, because that's where I begin to learn from you as well. And I'll simply go through the PowerPoint, putting the slides up on the screen, and hopefully this will be a good introduction to our evening together. So I think we live in a world where we know very well of the challenges that are facing us today. This is no secret. Nothing that I say here on this screen really will surprise you. Contemporary societies are now more than ever confronted with the question of religion's role in the public sphere. And Imran was right that I have a certain optimism, or I prefer the word hopefulness, that I believe that God's plan for the world will not be frustrated by those who are violent and negative. Nonetheless, the challenges are real, and I think in the 21st century, none of us can escape the possibility and danger of facing up to the problems before us. As religious communities encounter one another in such an open world, there is a need to ensure that such encounters bring about positive experiences such as mutual learning, trust, and the spirit of toleration. In a sense, the spirit of toleration is the easiest of those claims, that we learn to live together, we learn to be respectful of one another. But toleration, in some sense, is only the minimal starting point. This is not enough. Rather, my claim, and really has already been eloquently put, we need to trust one another and have enough respect for one another that we believe it's possible to learn interreligiously in some depth, because the other tradition also is in its own way good and holy and true, and because in learning from the other tradition we can deepen and enrich our own. So the mere toleration of sort of keeping our distance respecting the other but hanging back is better than violence, is better than hatred, but it's only the beginning. And I think the idea is, how do we begin to understand one another across religious bounds? Amid the rise of exclusivist identities, ours alone is true. Yours has nothing to do with ours. I think it's our job to learn about how ideas cross-pollinate, cultural practices hybridize, and identities intersect. And so that is what we'll be talking about tonight. I can't help but point out the picture here. I was in Gujarat in India in 2017 visiting the Swaminarayan community, a very learned, ascetic community of monks at their training center in Sarangpur. And they invited me to be there with them and to speak to the senior monks and to have a conversation about religion in today's world. And I think it was, I put the slide basically to entertain you, but nonetheless also to show a certain kind of hopefulness that when we see, as Imran was pointing to, what's actually going on and the eagerness in different traditions to learn, then I think we can have some hope for the future. The challenges are around us and inside us. And this, again, is no surprise. You wouldn't be here if you didn't already know the points I'm making. But the global problems are large, and they will not be resolved in the lifetime of anyone in this room. Poverty, violence, the crisis of refugees, environmental degradation, loss of democracy, and of respect for human rights, racism, and other forms of bias. If one wants to be gloomy, one can be gloomy saying things used to be better than they are now, and that in the 21st century things seem to be going wrong, politicians seem to be losing their way, a certain mean-spirited narrowness seems to be creeping in so many different countries. And I think this is not a Christian problem or a Muslim problem or a Hindu problem or an African problem, but all of us as human beings, we live on this one earth. We live in a world where the temperatures are rising, where the seas are rising, where so many people who are so poor in so many places are looking to move to places that are safer and better for their families. And this is for all of us. And we are all the children of God, I would say, and that God wants us to be able to talk to one another about these issues and to face up to the fact that unless we work together, then nothing will be accomplished in the long run. So we have to deal with these issues realistically and not pretend that the world is simply in a good place. But I think some of the challenges that are religious challenges are also inside us and inside the communities to which we belong. You may take note of these points as I raise them and say, well, it does or doesn't apply so well to the community to which I belong, because I'm happy to have questions that push me or challenge some of the points I'm making so we can see how this goes. But secularism and secularization, again, I do not know the situation in Singapore. I cannot attest to how things are here. But certainly it seems that everywhere in the world, and certainly where I live in New England, in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts, increasing number of people are secular, not only spiritual but not religious, but also losing a sense of religion altogether. People who have no affiliation, people who resist any kind of community belonging religiously, is kind of eating away around the outside of the traditions to which we belong. And in certain cultures, people may stay in their tradition because they're afraid not to, or there's no place for the person who's secular. But in countries where one can make a big choice and make a free choice, it seems that people are simply moving away. And I think all of us, no tradition is exempt from the fact that young people, particularly young people, are beginning to say, why bother with religion? Look at all the terrible things religion does. Or, I wish I could be a believer, I just don't get it. And I certainly, in the parish I help out in on Sunday mornings, some of the young people who come are struggling. I want to come, I want to be here, but I don't get where the faith is supporting me anymore. And what does the priest, what does the imam, what does the religious leader say about these things, I think is about all of us. I've already said this point, and it's been said so many times, and the organizations supporting this lecture know this, but no community exists in a vacuum. No community is an island unto itself. Nobody can pretend that they know nothing about other religious traditions. And no tradition, I think, can reasonably say, when we do our work, the entire community, the entire nation, the entire society will be only of our own religion. There was, to speak of my Roman Catholic tradition, there was certainly in the great colonizing, colonial, missionary period, a hope in the 16th century, 17th, 18th century that all of Asia would become Christian, and that the emperor of China would become a Christian, the Mughal emperor in Akbar in India would become a Christian, and all of Asia would become Christian. And I remember as a child these kind of predictions that eventually the other religions will slip away and everyone will be Christian. Well, that's not going to be the case. And I think no religious tradition can have a fond hope that everyone will belong to their religion only. This does not mean that God's plan is not for the whole world, or that the faith given to my community or your community is not global. But none of us in our lifetimes will see pluralism, poof, disappear. And so we have to learn to live with it in a better way. Individualism is a problem, or a challenge at least, particularly among young people. The problem of not being able to belong anymore, even if they're not secular, but rather spiritual but not religious. So many of the students I teach at Harvard University, even in the Divinity School, say, I can't belong to a religion, I disagree with too many things that they say. I don't want to be there every Friday or Saturday or Sunday. It doesn't make any sense to me. So they pick and choose, a little of this, a little of that, or simply go walk on the beach or climb the mountain and keep their distance from the religion. What do we do about this individualism where people do not want to be part of the community anymore? And what do we want to do, particularly when the younger generations, the millennials, may be looking and saying, I don't get what you people are doing. So congratulations, you've done this for your whole life, but it's not inspiring me to do it for my whole life. And I think we have to wake up and be aware of this. Loss of old ways of learning, the rise of new media, we've hardly mastered. I could now at this point take my phone out, excuse myself and just look at my phone for 5 minutes. The media are changing. We visualize things differently. We learn differently. And I think this is going to change the very idea, and I'll say more about this, about books, reading, study. What does it mean to learn? And I realized that maybe 500 years ago when the printing press was invented, the monks in the monasteries in Europe were pulling out their hair, if they had any, or pulling on their beards, saying, oh, the printing press is going to ruin everything. We used to copy the manuscripts by hand. That was the way to learn. And we survived the printing press. I think we'll survive the iPhone as well. But we have to catch up and say, what about the visual? What about media? What about fast-moving Facebook or other forms of communication? Are our traditions not simply traditional and rooted? Are they stodgy, unable to imagine where young people are leading us today? So these are problems that we all share, and I think they're changing the way we think about how we are going to be religious. So how do we act and learn? And also for those of us, I think everyone here is an educator in some way, teach and write and build community. How do we do this in the 21st century amidst all these problems around us without getting anxious and worried and depressed, but rather finding ways to be able to deal with the future in a way that's true to my tradition, true to your tradition, but moving us forward. To not let these problems overwhelm us and not to pretend that they are not there. When Imran and I had discussed this event, which I've been looking forward to for quite a while, we came up with several questions to put forward. And if you don't think I properly answer these questions in the next 30 minutes or so, then when they come to the question period, ask them again and say, Professor, could you try again, or something like that would be a good thing to say. So how do we properly understand the issue of diversity within and across faith traditions, and why is this important? Again, diversity can be a flat fact, a fact of life we can't do anything about, or diversity can be an invitation to learn interreligiously. And instead of simply passing the places of worship of other traditions, or simply noticing that people dress differently than I do, or that people pray in different languages, to stop and say, this plurality, this diversity, is an invitation to be religious in a slightly different way. And I would like to think that we can face up to this fact of life, challenge, but also see it as an opportunity, that this is a God-given possibility that enables us to do better, more, and more deeply than we've done in the past. And to learn from the other religiously means also that you and I have to look into our hearts and look into our traditions and say, am I a Catholic Christian because I was born that way? Or many years later, am I affirming it because I want to be what I am? And any of us to ask, are our roots in our tradition a matter of habit, custom, fear of changing, or do we have 21st century ways of saying, this is what it means to be Catholic or Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist or other traditions?
Second question that Imran and I worked out, or a cluster of questions you might say, how can we develop deep learning amid religious differences? How can this learning be fruitful in enriching public discourse for the common good? So the theme of this lecture is deep learning. It's very good, again, that we tolerate one another, that we have general respect for each other, that we have some sense of what the difference is between a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, and so on. But can we go deeper than that? Can we go deeper into our own tradition, but also the other traditions? And I think this is something we can do and should do. And this is really the core of what I say. The premise, of course, is religious literacy, as I might call it, in our own tradition. You can't learn very well from other people's religious traditions if you don't even know your own. And therefore, a kind of, again, an examination of you or me ourselves. How well do I know my tradition, or do I just say this is what I am? I'm a Catholic, but I don't know Catholic tradition. How well do we know our own tradition? Do we go deep? Do I know more about my own tradition than I did 10 years ago or 20 years ago? How is that depth there? But this depth, I think some people would say, I go deep into my own tradition and that's the end of the story. I know my tradition, I need nothing else. But I think for me the point is that religious literacy and interreligious literacy are connected. The ability to go deep into my tradition is like a gravity center, a balance that enables me to go out as well, and to be able to learn interreligiously. So not simply interreligious learning instead of knowing my tradition, nor going deep in my tradition instead of paying attention to the other, but both. And I think this is that some of us at least can be doing this. Studying other tradition or traditions is good in itself. I mean, so many times people ask me, and you may ask me when I stop talking, why are we doing this? What is this for? Professor, you've been studying Hinduism for 45 years or 46 years. Why did you do that? What is it for? And to some extent, it's good in itself. Learning is good in itself. You don't have to justify reading a book. You don't have to justify becoming wiser. You don't have to justify opening your mind to the reality around you. And I would say that just as you can say we're never finished reading the Bible or the Quran or the scriptures of Hinduism, the Veda, and so on, we're never really done with saying, okay, I know a little bit about your tradition, enough, I'm finished. No, we can keep going deeper. But it also, I think, has a value. If we have more people who are deeply rooted in their own tradition, who deeply learn from the other traditions, this is a good too. It creates a better human race, a better world in which we live, again, not giving way to the fundamentalists and the violent and the haters, but rather saying we are woven together because we respect and know each other more deeply. So we need to form persons in all of our communities who know other traditions in some depth. How we do this depends on, are we talking primary school or secondary school, colleges, universities, seminaries? But I think if you finish seminary training, and I would say this to Catholic organizations, if you finish your seminary training and you've only learned about Catholicism, well, it wasn't a very good education. And I would, who am I to speak for Islam or Hinduism or other traditions? But I would have the same instincts to say that if you only know your own tradition, you don't really know your own tradition. You have to be able to learn from the other traditions as well. And therefore, it has to be part of our educational processes. That whatever our religious training is, part of it has to be interreligious training. And that means that we need to be able to teach better, write better, act together better, in deeper knowledge of one another. And I think that is indispensable in today's world. So all of that is kind of general points. But I thought it might be interesting if I made it more personal for a few minutes. So I've already said that in the introduction that I entered the Jesuit order in 1968. I was just turned 18 a few days before. I'm still a Jesuit, still a priest 51 years later, and so on and so on. So my life story is a particular life, not the same as yours, I'm sure. I mean, nobody in the room will have quite the life story that I have, and we need to pay attention to where we come from. So I grew up Catholic in New York City, born in Brooklyn, New York. Roman Catholic, Irish Catholic family. My grandparents my father's parents both came on the boat over from Ireland. My mother's father came over, his family came over 100 years earlier during the so-called potato famine in Ireland, surely by boat in the mid-19th century. And my mother's family are German Catholics, and they came over probably around the late 19th century. And we were all staunch Catholics. We grew up Catholic. We knew about Protestants. We knew where the Protestant churches were. There were a few Jewish people in the neighborhood. But we were taught as children, just be nice, smile, and then keep going. There's no need to go into a Protestant church because there's nothing there. God is in the Catholic Church. God is not in the Protestant church. So we were taught in this way not to be haters, or certainly not to be violent or anything, but just keep to your own. Keep to your own people. And this was in New York City, even in the 1950s, a very diverse community. But we weren't taught to be diverse. I went through the Catholic primary school. All the sisters taught me all 8 years of my education. I went to a Jesuit high school, and the fathers were the main teachers in the school. But again, it was kind of building Catholic identity. Being Catholic, no harm to your neighbors who are not Catholic, but just keep to yourself, keep to your own people. And I say this to disabuse you of any suspicion that I was born interreligious, or that at 5 years old I was reading the Bhagavad Gita or something like that. No. I grew up in a very traditional Catholic way, and when I was just turned 18, I entered the seminary. So I was not adventuresome. I didn't go off and have a wild time in college or experiment with my life. This was the 1960s. I could have done it. But I entered the Society of Jesus. It was a time of great change. So the Vietnam War was disrupting American society. Richard Nixon was about to be elected president. The flower children, the sexual revolution, all kinds of things were being thrown off, and society was changing in a very great way. The Roman Catholic Church was changing itself greatly. So having been for 400 years kind of frozen in place because of the Protestant Reformation and the feeling that other Christians were against us, and that's not the way we think today. But the church, Pope John the 23rd, in 1958 or 59 said, we have to open the windows of the church and let some fresh air in. So by the time I entered seminary, it was a more exciting period of change. And in particular, there was the changing attitude toward other religions. I think like any of our traditions, if you go back and look, you can find all kinds of unfriendly things said about other religions. You can look back and say, oh, I wish they hadn't done that. Scenes of violence, scenes of hatred, burning people at the stake, raising armies to go and invade their country, and so on. We know that these terrible things have happened in the past, but it's possible for a religion to do better than it's done in the past. Just because we were awful 200 years ago doesn't mean we have to be awful today. And so the Roman Catholic Church in 1965 issued a document called Nostra Aetate, in our time. And in this document, my favorite passage is this passage, where the Catholic Church said, when we think of particularly Judaism and Islam, but also Hindu and Buddhism and other religions, we need to have a different attitude. 100% Christian, 100% Catholic, but open. So the Catholic Church rejects none of the things that are true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere attentiveness those ways of contact and of life, those precepts and teachings, which though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless by no means rarely reflect the radiance of that truth which enlightens all people. So the basis of it is Christ is everywhere, and the light of Christ is shining. This is a Christian statement. But I think for me, as a seminarian and getting started in life, the attitude of the church was, whatever is true and holy in these religions, the church does not reject it, even if they differ in many ways from what the church teaches. And I think this was, for me as a young man, incredibly powerful, because it opened up a new attitude, and it also seemed to say, whatever is true and holy in the religions, we'll go and find out. Find out what's true in Hinduism, find out what's holy in Islam, find out what's good in Chinese religions. You can't honor and respect those things unless you actually know them. And the fathers meeting in Rome weren't about to be the scholars of different religions, but I found them to be giving permission, saying to us, go out and seek what is good and holy and true and beautiful in other religions. So even though I entered seminary and was going to get a very Catholic training for 10 years before I became a priest, it was in this time when a sense of it's possible to open things up and to find, even if you're 100%, 110% committed to Christ, you can find that Christ is not only in the church, not only among us, but everywhere. And I would think that in our different faith traditions, East and West, there would be other ways of saying the same thing. Having a deep faith rooted in my tradition doesn't prevent me from having kind of a universal, global sense that God is everywhere. But we can talk about that as well. So as a young man, I took off to Kathmandu. This not very clear picture, I'm the guy in the middle there. The main point is to show that I used to be younger than I am now. So you can stare at that for a moment. But in 1973, when I was 5 years into seminary, I went to Kathmandu and taught school in Kathmandu for 2 years. St. Xavier's School, founded by the Jesuit fathers at the invitation of the King of Nepal, who invited the Jesuits from India to come up and set up a school. His son, the future King Mahendra, had gone to a Jesuit school, and he said, I want a good school, I want the Jesuits to come. And so the Jesuit fathers came up to Kathmandu in 1950, and a very well-established, respected school by the time I got there in the 70s. And I think for me, I won't go into too much detail because I want to keep going, time is short, is that when I was suddenly in the classroom as a young seminarian, and all the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist, suddenly I realized that I can't teach these boys unless I learn from them. And I can't teach them and show kind of my Christian identity or my Christian wisdom unless I was willing to take seriously their identity, their Hinduism, their Buddhism. So I began to visit their temples and stupas and holy places, go to the festivals. We set up a puja room, a worship room in the school where boys could bring in images of Krishna, Rama, the Buddha, Saraswati, the goddess, and so on. And it was an unusual thing to do in a Catholic school, but it worked. It had a certain kind of power to it. And in class, instead of, we would discuss sometimes a passage from the Gospels, but also a passage from the Bhagavad Gita, or a passage from the Jataka tales, the lives of the Buddha. And we'd bring these into class, and it seemed to work. I didn't lose my faith. They didn't lose their faith. Their parents didn't come and throw stones through the school's windows. The fathers didn't kick me out. But a beautiful thing began to happen. And for me, it was a sense of finding that I could be Catholic and a seminarian, a priest, a Jesuit, and still learn deeply from another tradition. Again, I didn't start this way. I grew up Irish Catholic New York. But kind of the vision I had in the 70s was, it is possible. You will not lose your faith by studying another religion. You are not betraying your principles by having an open mind. And for me, this became then a way of life. As I say there, I went to graduate school, University of Chicago, in 79 to 84. I studied my Sanskrit. I learned some Tamil. I went to India for studies, Mylapore area of Madras in South India, reading Sanskrit texts and so on like that, because I wanted to go deep. Now, not everyone can be a professor and take off a few years and go get their PhD, surely. But nonetheless, to be able to say, it actually is good to learn the languages of the other traditions, even if you just do one.
So learn Arabic, or learn Latin, or learn Sanskrit, or learn Chinese, or learn an African traditional language, whatever. But to go deep, and I had this great blessing at the University of Chicago to be able to study my languages. I've gone to India many times, sites and temples. I've added a few temples here in Singapore this week to my list. I've had friendships, Hindu friendships from ordinary lay people to swamis and gurus and so on over the years. And I think for me it's been also spiritual insights that I wouldn't have had if I had only known my own Catholic faith. But rather by going to India and experiencing, I was able to somehow see in my own heart my own Christian faith differently. So again, a lot of it was for me experiential. Then I'm a teacher, a professor. So I taught for 21 years in the Catholic Department of Theology at Boston College. And then, as Imran said, in 2005, I switched over to Harvard University, a different context, but nonetheless continued to be teaching. And I think everything I think as a teacher, I think as somebody who wants to communicate. And learning in all of this that it's possible to be committed to your own religion and still learn deeply from another without losing your faith. So that's, again, the basic principle coming again. And by now, I would not call myself a Hindu Catholic or a Catholic Hindu, a hyphenated person, but rather say I'm simply a Catholic priest. I'm a Catholic priest who's been studying Hinduism for most of my life. And the difference is that it's not like some weird third thing. Like you're not quite Buddhist, but you're a Buddhist Christian, or you're a Buddhist Hindu, or you're a Hindu Muslim, or you're a Jewish Buddhist, or something like that. No, I'm just 100% Catholic, but a way of being Catholic is to learn from other religions. And I would not let anyone say that they're more Catholic than me in principle. They may be saints, but nonetheless, not because of my study of Hinduism is anyone more Catholic than I am. So back home, this is, again, to entertain you, a picture of my office at Harvard. And if you look closely, you can come up afterwards and look at the screen, images and statues, symbols of different religious traditions, all kind of together on the shelves. And if I showed you more of the office, you could see that there are many more as well. And I think part of it is to say, when students come in my office, they see Hindu, they see Catholic, they see Muslim, they see Buddhist, they see Jewish, they see it. And that for me, reading the book is the main thing, but reading the book is not the only thing. And having this wider vision matters greatly. In teaching and writing, and I'll go a little bit quickly because I want to stop in about 15 minutes, again, learning deeply, slowly, over time, being patient, even if things seem to be too slow in some people's understanding. Creating a clear, hard, fuller norm for learning, reading, education, practice worship in your home tradition. That is extremely important as the starting point, but it opens the way for interreligious learning. It doesn't close the door, it opens the door. Again and again, I'll come back to that point. And some of us must learn deeply interreligiously. And this deep learning is a call from God. It's a vocation. It's not saying, well, I'm a religious person, but then I thought I'd do something else part of the time. I mean, for me, it's been a sense, this is part of what God calls us to. We live in a pluralistic world, and in the pluralistic world in which we live, God is saying, use your brain, open your eyes. As they say, you have one mouth, but you have 2 ears, so learn to listen. Pay attention to the people around you. This is a vocation. It's a way of life. Deep learning is to be cultivated. It's not to be rushed. You can't tell people, you know, I've given you 6 months to learn the other religion. What did you conclude? If somebody says, well, I need more time, I need like 10 years, you can't criticize them. It's a long process. It's a long process of being in my own religion, and it's a long process of learning from the other. And if somebody says, I need more time, give them your blessing and pray for them that they succeed. And this, of course, opens into ways of living and acting over time. So all of this, briefly, I would say, goes back to what Imran mentioned and Yaacob mentioned, comparative theology. And you could call this perhaps interreligious theology if you wanted, or you might have some other favorite name. But for me, the point was that it's theology, and in my tradition, Catholic theology. It's not less than theology, it's not other than theology, but it's comparative. It's open to the other religious traditions. It's a form of faith-seeking understanding, Faith is not the enemy of understanding. Faith is not blind faith. Faith is not closed-minded. But faith can be seeking to understand what faith believes. And therefore to say, I believe in certain teachings of the Catholic Church, then turn your mind on and say, well, what do we mean by this? How can this be so? Not to throw it out the window, but to question it so as to go deeper. So theology, comparative theology, is that kind of understanding. As was already explained very nicely, it's not comparative religion, it's not neutral, it's not simply a history project, it's not looking for the essence of religions, but it's more this back and forth dynamic. I go from my tradition to the other, and I come back. This back and forth, which my subjectivity, my personality is very much part of what I do. It's not about conflict of truth claims. It's not about my doctrines versus yours. You can't avoid those questions entirely, but nonetheless, they're only part of a larger reality, and that the learning needn't stop because we disagree on certain points. It's a form of study. It's sustained over time. So I'll just tell you, I forgot to bring piles of books with me from America, so I can't sell them to you. But just to give you a sense of the kinds of books I've written, 1998, Hindu Wisdom for All God's Children, a book that tries to show how Catholics, 7 different ways Catholics can learn from Hinduism. A very simple book that people still buy. Hindu God, Christian God, 2001, that when Catholic and Christian theologians talk about the nature of God, the identity of God, the existence of God, God in the world, God the revealer, all of this, you can find parallel themes in Hinduism. And if you really want to understand the existence or nature of God, there's no reason not to study Hinduism as well. That the intellectual process of studying traditions opens up across the boundaries. Or the follow-up book, Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary. I do not believe that the Virgin Mary is a Hindu goddess, but nonetheless I believe that there's a way in which the privileging of the supreme feminine, the feminine principle that you can see even here in a goddess temple, is in some ways not entirely unlike Mary in Catholic tradition. And there's a way of it saying that I can see Mary differently, the Virgin Mary, by paying attention to what I learned from Hindu goddesses. Now, in writing this book, I annoyed both conservative Hindus and conservative Catholics who didn't like the idea that I was, A, studying goddesses, it's none of your business, and secondly, how dare you compare the Virgin Mary to Hindu goddesses. But I think I did the right thing because it works. You can see these realities together. Or beyond compare, loving surrender to God, a very intense theme of giving yourself to God in the great Christian saint Francis de Sales, a doctor of the church, and one of the greatest of Hindu theologians, Vedanta Deshika, and how they're in different ways actually pointing us to the goal of life is to give yourself over to God. So you become more pious, more spiritual by interreligious study, not less so over time. I did a book called His Hiding Place is Darkness a few years ago, reading mystical poetry, the Song of Songs in the Bible, as read by medieval Christian saints like Bernard of Clairvaux, along with Hindu mystical poetry from the Alvars of South India, the great Tamil saints of the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. Again, saying that poetry can be a bridge. Passionate religious poetry can help you to cross the boundaries. And trying to say that being mystical is not simply a privilege of one tradition by itself, but if I read the mystical poetry of another tradition, this can open things up for me. And my new book, that'll be out next month, reading the Hindu and Christian classics, learning to read more deeply, more patiently across religious boundaries is something we can do. It's kind of doubling down and say, get the books out. Stop being so busy, stop talking so much, and read the book. And read a book in your own tradition, but every book you read in your own tradition, read a book in the other tradition too. Learn to do this over time. Again, more quickly, we can teach differently. Colleges, universities, secondary schools, seminaries, wherever you're teaching. And these are just some courses I'm teaching recently. Krishna and Christ, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary, God, Hindu, and Christian. So it's one thing to write a book, it's another thing to try it out in the classroom and to see if it worked with students, master's level students, doctoral students, undergraduate students, because they don't always believe what I want them to believe, or they don't know the things I think they should know, and they have questions I never thought of. And so the interaction in the classroom is a great, exciting thing, where you try out in the classroom courses like this, and they open up possibilities that the professor never had before teaching the course. And I think that's part of what we do. And again, this idea of new media. I found this clever picture on the web, the books with a phone in front of it. I'm a book person. I'm too old to change at this point. I don't do Facebook and such things. But there may be in the future exciting ways of learning that use the new technology that I can't even imagine. But the point will be the same. Interreligious learning based on deep learning in your own tradition, the crossing back and forth, opening your mind because you're a person of faith, and you go from there. Now, I've been studying Hinduism my whole life, and I can't go into this very deeply, but I do want to make this point, and we can come back to it in our discussion once I stop talking, is that it can seem too expert. So that's fine, Professor. If you have the time to sit down and learn Sanskrit and spend 40 years reading it, then it works. But what if I don't know the language? Or what if I don't know Chinese? Or what if I don't know Arabic? Or if I don't know Swahili? Or whatever language we're talking about, if I'm not an expert? And in class, a few times now, I've tried to use a text from the Quran, using the new study Quran that Professor Nasser and his disciples put together, a wonderful big fat book full of notes and commentary and so on, to try out and say, can I exemplify going beyond my expertise? And if I can learn from Catholic and Hindu traditions, can I also learn from Islam? Can I also learn from Chinese religions or African religions? And I'll make more mistakes because I don't know Arabic. I can't check the original. But to say that I think this too is possible. And of course, everything I say is possible. You don't have to know Latin or Hebrew to learn from the Jewish tradition or the Christian tradition, but back and forth. And obviously, I found Surah 19, Maryam, very powerful because it speaks so eloquently of Zechariah and John the Baptist and of Mary and Jesus. And familiar figures from the Hebrew Bible, Abraham and Moses, other prophets, putting them forward, but with a fresh eye and in a way that Christians don't think of these things. And they can say, well, I can't do this. I'm sorry, it's different from the Bible. I'll have no time for this. That would be, for me, faith that closes itself down. But for me, when I see the structure, and this is my own little outline of the chapter, and we don't have time right now to go through it, but rather to say that there's an exciting possibility of beginning to learn and think about Jesus and Mary slightly differently because of reading, even in English translation, the Holy Quran and reading Maryam. And I think any of us can do things like this as well. We learn differently, we see differently, we begin to understand how we think and see in our own tradition. And I found Surah 19, and others can correct me either in the question period or afterwards, by saying, my sense is that this is all about, it's about prophecy and about prophets. It's a way of thinking about the power of God's word, God making things to be, God making reality to come to be, and chosen individuals like Zechariah or Mary or Abraham or Moses and other prophets, Jesus himself, given the overflow of the word of God, and then speaking the power and the glory of God. And the word is enough. And this is not unknown to the Christian tradition, but it's something for which I'm very grateful to Islam, to the Quran, to the Prophet, for making this so powerful and so clear in this chapter. And I think my favorite verse in this chapter is 58. So summarizing about the prophets, they all are those whom God has blessed from among the prophets of the progeny of Adam, of those whom we carried with Noah, of those the progeny of Abraham and Israel, and of those whom we guided and chose. When the signs of the compassionate were recited unto them, they would fall down prostrate and weeping. And the sense of intense belonging and intense emotional impact, I think is a beautiful thing, and that we should be able to testify to one another. I don't just believe this rationally, or I don't just believe it because my parents did, but it actually touches the heart. And the great prophets had their hearts touched, and the tears came from their eyes, and I think you can catch this a bit from another tradition as well. And I think this, for me, just to give an example of how comparative theology works, this passage of falling down prostrate and weeping reminded me of Luke chapter 7, the Gospel of Luke. And a woman in the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating at the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet. She began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. She continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. So where does comparative theology lead? I could go on for an hour about this. It's not that it gives you an insight that is not Christian or not Muslim, but for me as a Christian, it makes me go back to the Gospel of Luke and read it differently, with a certain greater intensity, because the prophet has opened the door by talking about what prophecy does, and it helps me to see it better. There are still problems. The surah seems to indicate that Jesus is saying, I'm not God, I'm not the Son of God, God does not have children. So big theological problems that we don't want to pretend aren't there. But we do learn a lot along the way. The transcendence of God, God's pure and spiritual being, God's sovereign power, ability to create simply by the Word, seeing Jesus in a way a Christian would never see Jesus without turning to the Quran. There are big problems, theological problems between Muslims and Christians on certain doctrines, but I think my sense is that often those become stumbling blocks. So we build a wall and saying, well, the reason I can't really talk to you or learn from you is because we disagree on this and this and this, so let's build the wall. My sense is don't obsess over the differences. Don't obsess over the doctrinal differences, but rather say, even if that's true, read the whole surah, read the whole gospel, and still you can learn even if you disagree on important points. It's not 100% we agree on everything or 0% we agree on nothing, but if you open your mind and heart, you can learn a lot even from people with whom you don't have 100% consensus. And I think this is an example of that for me. So to conclude, I'm just about done, a couple of more images. Comparative theological learning is not the most important aspect of interreligious dialogue and interreligious cooperation. So I would be patting myself on the back and lying to you if I said, this is the most important thing in the world, and whatever you're doing, you should stop doing so that you can follow me. No. I mean, there's so many other forms of interreligious learning, of dialogue, of cooperation in society, all the different groups supporting this lecture tonight. All of those things are 100% wonderful. And I would not be the one to say, everybody stop everything else and get out the book and just read from now on. That would be absurd. But nonetheless, some of us need to do this work and share the benefits with others. And I would like to say that in the world in which we live, but also hypothetically in Singapore, there should be Christians who study Hinduism, and Hindus who study Buddhism, and Buddhists who study Islam, and Muslims who study Christianity. And we should be able to have one or two people in each of our communities who stand out for this, and then share it with everyone else. And that every community is at a loss if all your wise and learned teachers only know their own tradition. I think that would be sad. Now, I'm not sure you agree with this, but I think the point is, this is not the most important thing, but some of us should do this to make it work. Again, it's patient, it takes time, it goes on over a long period of time, and we need to learn to do this together. Further, in conclusion, how do you do this? You are not me. You mostly were not born in Brooklyn, New York, I'm sure. You're not Catholic priests, as far as not everyone, well, maybe there is at least one Catholic priest here. But nonetheless, there is a form of, my point is, I went back and I told you my story as a way of energizing my presentation. What's your story? Why are you here tonight? Why are you interested in interreligious learning? And there's something in your history, God's work in your life, that enables you to think and hear and listen beyond your own tradition. And I think to go back to our own stories and say, well, Professor, you did it that way, but my story is different and I'm going to do it this way, is a wonderful thing. But to do that, we sort of have to know our own stories, and therefore to know that there are many different ways to engage in dialogue, to manifest interreligious cooperation. So decide how you can learn, how much time you can spend, how you will study, and I think you'll always find it beneficial. Do something to learn interreligiously and you will never regret it. But just do it to start. And then finally, to end off, this was yesterday at the Srinivas Perumal Temple, saying that even you can teach old dogs new tricks, even at my age, visiting a beautiful temple and learning by visiting it. And I think we can just keep doing this all our lives, no matter how young or how old we are. And with that happy note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For me, it's been a wonderful journey since this morning's breakfast and now. I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the audience. I wouldn't want to dominate. Let me open up to the floor for any questions, comments, or even sharing that you may want to do. Who would like to start the ball rolling? Yes, sir, please. Is there a roving mic? Could you just state your name? You don't have to say your IC number. Under PDPA, we're not supposed to collect that.
Thank you, Professor Clooney and Professor Yaacob for sharing. Isn't there someone from Harvard University who is into artificial intelligence and robots that are coming up that are so or increasingly human-like that he's in fact advocating that there's a certain aspect of, like in terms of the religious rights of robots that we ought to really pay attention to. Hey, he's serious, he's not kidding. Is there any basis for that? And also, with AI coming up, right, and deep learning, like Prof. Yaacob mentioned earlier on, but seriously, is it possible to apply deep learning in the field of comparative theology and, have this AI to learn, to read all the holy books that were ever written and to maybe break into new fields?
Yes.
We can both answer these questions. I would say this, surely there is someone at Harvard working on artificial intelligence. It's a very big campus, so I don't know the person personally. But I would say that just as we can learn interreligiously, we need to keep at the conversations between faith and technology, faith and science, faith and the various forms of new learning, new understanding that are taking place. I could imagine two things. One would be, what does it mean to be human and to have human rights, such that one could say that artificially intelligent beings have that capacity or not? What is the soul? Where is the soul? What is relation between the soul and the computer? But then also to ask, is there a difference, let's say, between a Buddhist view of this possibility and a Catholic view? And therefore to have an interreligious conversation, not about the holy text, but about the where are we going technologically, and also genetic engineering, and so on like that. So many issues that mind boggle all of us, and to say where religiously we're going with those questions could be itself an interreligious conversation.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't want to add to that. Could we sort of bring back the conversation to what was presented by Professor Xavier about comparative theology? And I thought it's an interesting point that he made during the presentation, that in our attempt to learn the other faith, we don't change our own faith, but in fact it informs us even further about our own understanding of our theology. Anybody would like to ask a question? I saw a hand there. Sir, please. As I say, just introduce yourself, your name, so it's easy for us to have the conversation. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ian. Thank you for the talk just now. I've not heard of the term comparative theology until tonight, so thanks for introducing it and its distinction from comparative religion. So I guess I have a bit of a question/suggestion for you in the context of what happens next. But to do that, I want to paint a quick vision. One thing that is one of the byproducts of secularism is that religion becomes relegated to the individual sphere. So it becomes privatized, and we, I think each of us know, or many of us that belong to different faith traditions, know that religion has much to say about the individual, as much as it also has to say about society. So how society should be organized, how we should interact with one another, the relationships that characterize society, and so on. So then this piece of religion no longer finds expression, and hence why people may be turning away from religion, because they don't see the applicability, they don't see how it can be translated into action. So one of the things that comes to my mind is how the different faith traditions, in line with what you were saying, are able to identify very concrete actions in solutions to the world's problems, which you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. So one thing that comes to my mind is as people from different faith groups are able to come together, are able to use their combined knowledge of their respective religious traditions, are able to find the commonalities, and also by finding those commonalities deepen their own understanding, as in the way that you've described, they're able to come up with very concrete and practical action. So when you were discussing what you were piloting in your educational courses, or that component on education, it occurred to me that you might be able to pilot this kind of thing. You have people from different faith traditions that are tasked with, for example, how could, for example, participation in the life of society be better promoted and engage people of all walks of life by looking at religions as a system of knowledge, and come up with something that's very practical. So this is something that came to my mind. What did you think of this, and what else do you see as the next stages? Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating, important suggestion. I think in some ways this is what we naturally will do, that there are issues facing society and there are possibilities before all of us that instinctively, as I was just answering the first gentleman, well, what do different people in different traditions say about this? And it's a matter, as you say, of individuals, but also of entire social networks being involved. My fear would be that it would come down to, again, the Buddhist sits over there, and the Hindu there, and the Muslim there, and the Jew there, and the Christian here, and so on. And we just go around the table and say, here's what I think about this issue. And here's the suggestion. So I, by reading the Bible, and you by reading the Bhagavad Gita, this is what we say. And then we all have coffee and go home. What I want to push further and say, instead of my asking, let's say, a Muslim, what would Islam say about this, I should be prepared for that by having for a year or two been studying Islam myself. So that the dialogue is not simply around the table about these 21st century issues, but that I'm already crossing over, and I don't need to go to Wikipedia to get what they say about this or that. How to make it deeper, certainly by dialogue and conversation, but by having people who are educated at least twice over as part of the conversation. So I think what I'm saying is a friendly amendment to what you're saying, that any practical issue of the 21st century needs to be approached interreligiously, because we're all in this together. But some of the people at the table are not simply the Catholic or the Hindu or the Muslim, but people who've already been deeply involved in studying the other, so that the cross-fertilization has taken place even before the gathering starts, I would say.
So the criteria for that conversation is that you must already be like Professor Xavier. You have to, you have to understand the other tradition so that it can be meaningful. Yep. Next, yes, please. There's a hand there, ladies, please.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation, Prof. My name is Vita. I just completed my fieldwork in Indonesia, making a comparison of alternative media based on religions in 3 different media. The first one is Islam Community Radio. Second one is Catholic printed magazine, and the last one is Buddha digital news portal. So I would like to ask you, is there any possibility that media could provide a platform for multiple religious identity? I found that there is a big potential for them to collaborate or to integrate the media to share the good common. So what do you think about this? How to deal with the ego of each religious organization? In this case is the media organization. Thank you very much.
So just to clarify, when you say to deal with the ego of each tradition, what do you mean by that?
I found that this, for example, Islam Community Radio, they found that why should I collaborate with a Catholic and how to deal with that, first one, and then how media could provide platform for multiple religious identities. Is it possible to collaborate or integrate the media? Thank you very much.
I mean, I think you're raising a question that is beyond my expertise in part, because I mentioned several times, new ways of learning and new media, and you have been doing field work that shows how that works. So I'm not the best person for that. But I think that the question of the ego jumps out at me, because there's a certain sense in which even inventive people who are of different religious traditions may have, either individually or as a community, a sense of, we do this alone. We do this on our own. We don't need them for this. And I think that's a profound, it's profoundly understandable why I'm grateful to God for my tradition. I'm proud of it. We are in this together. That's wonderful. But it's also profoundly a mistake to imagine that the will of God is better enacted by religious individuals doing their own thing on their own. And that it's harder to work together. It's harder to say it won't simply be a Catholic radio broadcast or a Muslim media event or a Buddhist this or a Hindu that, but rather to say we're going to profoundly do this together, which at the beginning will be very slow and in the long run will pay off. But it's sort of like saying, sin is a common human phenomenon. Ego is a common human problem. The best of people can be caught up in pride or fear or self-protectiveness, regardless of their religion. And I think whether one is reading the book or doing a radio broadcast or a TV event or an online event, breaking through that ego and saying, it would be better for us if we did this together rather than we do it at this time zone or time and you do it at that time. No, to break through that. But your generation, I think, has to figure out how does that actually work out in the world of new media.
Thank you very much.
Yes, question? Yes, sir, please.
My name is Charles Chow, and like Father Professor Clooney, I'm also a Catholic. I have 3 issues. First one is an analogy. Second one is request for advice. And third one is, I think it's perhaps an insight into a Catholic problem that needs your advice too. First of all, analogy. I think this wonderful wonderful presentation is like understanding our alphabets. The alphabet is there, and it's can be used, to Romanize the Sanskrit, can be used for Hanyu Pinyin. So frankly speaking, religion is religion, but it's looked from different perspectives. And my problem is you do comparative theology, but where's the contrast? So perhaps the understanding of the contrast would fortify the comparison. Perhaps your insight and your inputs on this part of my analogy, alphabets that can be used in diverse ways. Second issue is really in Singapore, every July is multiracial harmony month. And people will dress in their respective clothing just for the sake of dressing. My request is, could you help advise, could you help us to make it, can I say more, can you make it more, could you help us to galvanize us better? not merely just a show off of food, show off of various costumes.
We don't allow foreign interference in Singapore politics.
Tonight we are here as a guest, and I request some advice on that. My last issue is I attend the Catholic Church, Holy Spirit Church, and the priest says that yoga is satanic. All right? I don't blame him because he has a certain facet that needs perhaps your coaching. I can give you the name of this priest. But in my opinion, all right, I think we have to keep our own house in order first. What we are trying now to bridge with Islam, to bridge with Buddhism, perhaps the own housekeeping, must be done. So perhaps this comparative thing, that we want to outreach to other faculties, other religions, could actually be done better internally. So what is being done or can be done? Your opinion, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me answer briefly, and we can also talk more afterwards because there are other hands up I want to leave time for. But on the first point, I think it's a good point to raise that comparative theology sounds like it addresses only similarities. And I think that may be a problem with the English word comparison, not clearly including comparison and contrast. I wouldn't say let's have a contradictory theology or a contrasting theology only. But that my understanding is that if you actually study something, you're going to see differences as well as similarities. If you're just sitting here and say, you have a beautiful religion and it's so much like my own, and I don't really know much about it, but I think it's beautiful, then these similarities will bubble up to the top. But if you say, here's a chapter of my text, read it, of the Quran or the Bible or Gita or whatever, you will begin to enumerate differences as well. And so I think that's important, not only the big differences that often people stop with, but smaller differences that just give it a different feel. So I agree that differences should be brought into the conversation. How to celebrate on these events and these interfaith weeks and so on like that, food and costumes and music and so on. It would be nice to have a table where books could be displayed and people could have little study group sessions and so on like that. That would be wonderful too. But I'll follow the advice and say I should not interfere. I don't have a permit to give advice on that question, so I better stop there. And then the third one, just a simple part of what you said. I've heard a number of people here and other places, isn't it dangerous for Christians to do yoga? Isn't it true that yoga is from the devil? And I would first of all try to understand why the priest is saying that or why the person is worried about this, and not dismiss it, because there may be something real there. But then ask them, what do you know about yoga? Have you ever practiced yoga? Have you ever read the Yoga Sutras? Have you ever read a book about yoga? What is it exactly that makes you so afraid? And as far as I can see, the devil has nothing much to do with yoga. That yoga is a discipline that can function in different Hindu traditions, but also Buddhist. You can have Christian yoga as well, as a way of discipline, focusing your life, clarifying your mind, that in itself may not be Christian, but it can be greatly helpful to the Christian. And I think as a professor, would be saying, you are very much against yoga, you're afraid of yoga. Do you know anything about yoga? Have you ever studied yoga? And if the person says no, let's say, well, why don't we meet a month from now after you've done some study and talk about it again? But just to get up and say yoga is bad and people should not do yoga seems to me to be unhelpful. And it gives bad example because somebody's talking about something they don't know and warning people off. That kind of bias can then be applied to others and say, I don't know anything about them, but keep away from them. And I think this is a dangerous path where ignorance leads the way.
By the way, there is a fatwa from Malaysia that yoga is haram. And I'm not sure whether they have read the book either, but there's a different matter altogether. There are two hands at the back. Anybody else? Three. Okay, I start with the lady at the back first, please.
Thank you. Good evening, professors. Thank you for the very enlightening sharing. I I have only one question, but please bear with me as I articulate my question. Okay.
Make it brief.
Okay. I underwent a personal mental health crisis in 2011, and it got me started on my spiritual journey. So I grew up in a semi-practicing Taoist family, and I spent a year after that mental health crisis attending religious classes in a Krishna temple, after which I went on to a Catholic church, and I'm newly baptized this Easter. So it sounds to me from your sharing that deep religious learning comes from studying the mysticism aspects of religions. And my question is, in faith communities where these mysticism aspects are either not deeply studied or not widely preached, possibly due to its depth that's deemed not easily understandable by the layman, what advice do you have? Thank you.
If I understand you, you mean that this interreligious learning is not something that's mentioned in church or in the temple and so on? Is that what you're saying? That
okay. So, personally, intuitively, I think the fundamental issue is that the mysticism part of the religions are not widely preached, as they may be too deep for the layman.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So thank you, and I appreciate you're mentioning your own personal journey, your personal experience. And that's what I partly said, well, this is my story, what is your story? And you learn from your what actually has happened in your life that gives you certain possibilities and not others. But I think that's an excellent point about the mystical side or the spiritual side of tradition. If that is missing, there's a danger that the worship on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday can come down to rules and regulations, moral codes, do this, don't do that, and also a lack of spiritual imagination. Like, because we have the rules here and the book says this, I can't imagine how you could do yoga, or I can't imagine how you could read Bhagavad Gita, or I can't imagine why you would go to church. A spiritual person who has some kind of spiritual imagination can, in fact, imagine greater possibilities. And if the leaders of the tradition are not opening the door to the mystical, then they may be, unfortunately, like putting their own people in chains or putting them in confinement, saying, all my religion really is a set of rules. Whereas you want to have this spiritual possibility, which doesn't do away with the rules. It's not as if rules are bad, but it gives you the possibility of saying, I who belong here can learn from there. Because it actually happens, because it touches my heart, because it's beautiful, because it speaks to me. That language of intuition and spirit also has to come into the discussion. And I think you're reminding us of that, so thank you.
But I think if I can take off that point, Prof, what she's saying is that the mystical part of the religions sometimes are not taught.
Right.
And therefore people don't understand that, basically. Yeah. But the next question would be, is it possible for the layman to even grasp the spiritual aspects of his or her religion?
I think, some people, when for much of the past several hundred years, until let's say 1960s, Roman Catholics, at least in the West, were warned away from mysticism, and saying that mysticism is like floating off the ground and hearing voices and things like that. And that just keep your feet on the ground and just be a Catholic, period. But then the great Catholic theologian Karl Rahner died in 1980. One of the great Catholic theologians of modern times said, every believer is fundamentally a mystic, which means that fundamentally to be human is to open into the mystery of God. And therefore there's no containment, that deep in ourselves is this infinity of possibilities. And therefore, if a church or other religious communities are excluding the mystical and giving no sense that the community, that there is this mystical possibility, they're not even understanding their own tradition. So some way of saying, of course you can understand mysticism if you're a layperson, because you are a mystic. And of course you can learn from mystical poetry because you already have this in your heart. How to do that is a matter of how do you teach it. But I think if it's missing, it's like saying, we only deal with dead bodies or something like that. No, you have to deal with the living spirit, which we don't control, but we enjoy.
Thank you, Prof. My name is CIFU. I attended your class yesterday, so I want to thank you so much for sharing about comparative theology. I just want to give a bit of context. What I'm going to, again, ask is also advice on two challenges I see. I've been involved in interfaith work for the last 13 years, exposed to at least 11 traditions and the diversity within different traditions. And the challenges I face with regards to learning across religious borders is one, with regards to heresy. So, for example, when I want to learn about something, or people want to share about something, and people would question me because they said this teaching is heretic. It could be within the Muslim tradition, or it could be as simple as another religion, for example, the Baha'i faith. I'm skipping a Baha'i devotionals to be here, so apologies. So, like, if I was supposed to share something what the Baha'i faith would say, their perspective on Muhammad, the Muslims would say we cannot be exposed to that because that would be heresy. So I want your advice on how you deal with that, reading about Jesus from another tradition, or the issue of heresy also within different traditions. Another challenge I see and I face is, okay, so I need to be honest, I have Hindu blood. Right. The reason is because my forefathers were Hindus. And we see that present today. This organization is called Majlis Ugama Islam Singapura. Majlis is Arabic, Ugama is Sanskrit, from agamas. Islam is again Arabic, and Singapura is Sanskrit. Right. We call fasting, instead of the Arabic word siam, we call it puasa, which is from upavasa. So we do have that tradition. But when people learn this different tradition, for example, if Muslims learn about Hinduism, they would learn it to be Puritan. So they learn it and they realize, hey, we have some syncretic form of Hinduism within our Islamic tradition, we need to take it away. And this is within marriage ceremonies, within certain practices of the Islamic life today. So that's the challenge, because people would learn about other religion, but they will go back to the tradition to remove this, which are already part of many, many cultural years of traditions. So what is your thoughts on those? Learning to remove instead of learning to enlarge the space.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful questions tied together there. I mean, on the second one first, I want to be respectful and sympathetic with people who want to keep their tradition pure, and people who believe that we need to protect it against outside dangerous influences. So that's a good instinct, to pass it on to young people in the proper way and so on like that. But I think it's also true that never was there a time when any tradition was purely only itself. So there's always going to be a sense that traditions have always been learning from other traditions, that traditions have always been interconnected. And the surprising fact that in a Muslim community there might be words that have a Sanskrit origin is not to say this is some kind of a terrible mistake, but that this is part of the complexity of who we are. And just as people have hybrid backgrounds, and one grandparent this and one grandparent that, my grandmother's side is German, the rest is Irish, and so on. We have these complications in life. Religiously, it's not better to say that a religion that's 100% pure is somehow better than a religion that has indebtedness to other religions. It doesn't take away from the revelation or the value of the prophecy or something, but the idea of radical purification seems to me to be simply unnecessary, because God doesn't require that of us. And so these ideas of, I just want Roman Catholic 100%, nothing Hindu, nothing Buddhist, nothing Protestant, nothing else, seems to be just an ungenerous kind of selfish form of Catholicism. Again, may be motivated by certain kinds of fear that are real, but it seems to be a mistake to kind of purify is not a healthy religious attitude. On the first part, again, and one way that would be manifest is to make charges of heresy. You can't do that because it's against our faith, or those people are doing something profoundly against our faith. I mean, I run into this sometimes when people who don't read my books have doubts about my books. And they say, you're clearly doing something wrong. We don't know quite what it is, but we're against what you're doing. And I think it's, again, partly there's such a thing as heresy. The idea of picking and choosing. And in the early Christian context, the doctrines hold together. You can't just pick the parts you like and say, I'm a certain kind of Christian and I leave out the other parts. But using this as kind of a red flag or a warning sign or a stop sign and say, I'm sorry, heresy, don't do that, has to in some way be talked about. Unless you have a tradition of absolute authority where the person in charge is unquestioned, which I think is unhealthy, there's some possibility to say, well, maybe it's heretical, or maybe we don't actually understand what they're talking about. So again, yoga is from the devil. Well, maybe we don't understand yoga. We don't want something from the devil creeping into my church. But maybe yoga is not at all what that fear has to do with. So charges of heresy should be very rare and very reluctant because they're often based on nothing much at all. And the heresy of the other is a viewpoint that's partial and maybe not enough, but actually is something we can learn from. So I think, you see, my attitude is to say, be respectful of where people are, but we shouldn't allow traditions to say, wrong, dangerous, because that seems to be closing down the mind, and a closed mind is not a religious thing. It's bad religiously, not good to have a closed mind.
If I could extend his second question, Prof, because this phenomenon of trying to find the pure path, because the path has been corrupted because of the influences, is quite dominant in a certain community because they want to go to heaven, and the only way to go to heaven is to go back to the pure path. What's your response to that?
I think this is probably true in every tradition. We want to follow the pure and straight path that leads to God or leads to heaven. And I think in some ways, I wrote that book called Beyond Compare, Loving Surrender to God. There's a certain sense of intense purification, giving up everything, becoming detached solely on the path. And this, I think, is a state of deep passion, deep love, deep trust in God that must be there. But that's not to be confused with kind of purifying society, purifying the mind, excluding all ideas that don't fit. Because I don't think one can say, if we only have words, let's say, if we have only words for Christians that have Hebrew and Greek roots, because the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, and anything that comes from cognate words from other languages or borrowings, we have to get rid of all that. That, I think, has nothing to do with the straight and narrow path that leads to God. Because that's about cultural purity, historical purification, denial of the past. So I'd like to think that being on the path to heaven and the path to God is possible even for a person who lives in a complex life. It'd be, in the horrible case of the Nazis, and the Nazis saying we want a pure German race, and that requires us to get rid of Jews and Gypsies and other people. It was a horrible thing, but it was a mistake in somehow assuming we would be better as a nation if we got rid of all of them. Likewise, it would be a mistake to say we would be better intellectuals if we never borrowed anything from anyone. And it just seems to be a really dangerous way to go that doesn't actually lead us to God.
Alan?
Yeah, thank you. Prof, you ended your lecture just now with a suggestion that what we need are individuals who are deep, not only in his tradition, but in at least another tradition. I thought that's a very serious suggestion for us to consider in Singapore. And in fact, when I was seated beside Professor Clooney just now, I whispered to him that I think we should clone him for Singapore. And he was very generous and extended his hand and said, take my DNA. So if any one of you can do that job of taking his DNA, please let me know. By the way, Prof, in this interreligious learning, as you move from your tradition to another tradition, learn and come back to your tradition, and to and forth, process of interreligious learning, you have not touched on another stage or another part which I think is equally important, that is the intra-religious learning. Because when you come back to your own tradition, you are not living in a vacuum. You have people around you, whether your family, friends, your community, and so on. And that aspect, that dimension is, to me, is also equally important as you go cross, a boundary to another tradition. So you have not touched that in your lecture, although in the question and answer just now you did allude to that. How do you organize that within the whole framework of deep learning across religious borders, intra-religious learning, and how do you think we should do it, and what do you think are the challenges and so on?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking that important question. So I often use the analogy of crossing over and coming home. Well, coming home can be a complicated reality. And I think on several levels. I would say on one level, it's a matter of, if you seriously belong to a religious tradition, you owe explanations. Like you have a path, you have a personal journey, and you do certain things and you learn certain things. But you should be able to explain to the people back home what you're doing. So if I run into lots of Catholics who feel that I'm doing something pagan, and I just say, oh, forget it, I don't owe you any explanation, that would be a mistake on my part. But rather to explain how this learning feeds back into Catholic identity, and actually is a very Catholic way of looking at the world. I quoted the passage from Vatican II, whatever is true and holy in the other religion. So I would use that kind of thing and say that all of this makes sense to us as Catholics according to my understanding of Catholic. So that kind of conversation, I think, would be necessary to have to show that the connections come back home again. The other level of intra-religious, within one's religion, would be the difficult phenomenon of progressives and conservatives in a tradition who simply have different views about what it means to be Catholic or Muslim, much less Catholic and Protestant, or Sunni and Shia, or Vaishnava and Shaiva, or Theravada, Mahayana, where within these different communities there are long traditions of difference. And you can say, well, you as a Catholic, you think you can do these things, but me as an evangelical Protestant, I don't think you can do those things. So we end up having a difficult conversation between two groups of Christians about this. And I think that's fair too, that you can't say we have a monopoly on Catholic, or we are the ones who decide what Islam is, and the others are all wrong, or we decide what Buddhism is and the others are all wrong. We owe explanation not only to our kind of immediate family, those close, but to people who have other views of Christianity or Buddhism, whatever, to show them that this is not betraying the tradition, let's say, in my case, back to Christ. Does that help? So that further conversation, I think, is very important. And to stress it, I think part of the logic of what my autobiography is to say, if a Catholic studies Hinduism, this is the kind of thing that happens. If I was a evangelical Protestant studying Buddhism, it probably would come out differently. Or if I was a Pentecostal studying Islam, it would come out differently. But Irish Roman Catholic New York meets South Indian Hinduism, and this is what happens, isn't necessarily what happens to everybody. But thank you, that's wonderful.
Can I just have a show of hands? I saw one at the back just now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's it. We have to close. It's 10 o'clock. Gentleman first over there in the glasses. Which one? Here. Wang, here. Sorry. Yes, sorry.
Excuse me.
My apologies.
Good evening. Thank you, professors. My name's Edwina.
Sorry, your name?
Edwina.
Edwina. My apologies.
I have a clarification about the deep learning and the emphasis on text. It does seem, to clarify, are you suggesting that the primary approach to learning about another religion is through its text? And if so, is there a limitation to this, given that the text, by itself can be void of context? And so how did you, in your journey learning about Hinduism, learn to see it as it saw itself, rather than to sort of approach their text and say, this is what it is to me?
No, thank you. Excellent question. And I would say several things. One would be reading texts carefully disabuses you of the view that you can immediately get what they're saying. The texts resist our simplifications. They're not passive in our presence. Like I can get the book to say anything I want. But reading in context, one of my rules about any serious academic writing I do is to read Hindu texts that have commentaries on them. And therefore to read a text simply by itself is something I wouldn't do. So a commentary, on Yoga Sutras, a commentary on Vedanta, whatever, to read with readers in the tradition in order to see how they read it. Because flying in as a modern American and saying, this 2,000-year-old Sanskrit text, I'm going to get what it means, could be very self-deluding without the sense of context. But I did mention also that, reading the text, I've also gone to India many times. I love visiting temples. I have Hindu friends, and so on. That I don't really believe it's all in the book in that limited sense. And that if you can enhance it by art, by music, by images, by visiting holy places, by going to countries where that religion is the majority religion, I think you learn much more and see beyond. So even when I mentioned being in Kathmandu, reading Bhagavad Gita in class with students, and then setting up a puja room, a worship room, and then going to the temple was part of the plan. But if I had to pick one way of interreligious learning, I'm enough of a professor to say I really do think reading is probably the most powerful. That seeing is wonderful, and visiting is wonderful, and talking is wonderful, but books are wonderful. They're really wonderful. And that if you have one good book in a tradition, you can learn almost infinitely from a great text, the classics. So I would dig in and say the classic texts really do work. But read them with commentaries, read them in context, listen to people in the tradition, and don't just read them on your own. If that helps, I think. But excellent question.
The gentleman at the back first. Wang, at the back behind you. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, Professor. Thank you for your talk tonight. And my name is Gary from the Free Community Church. I think you have impressed upon us the importance of deep learning across religious borders in order for us towards moving towards the common good. Two phenomena that we see that's going on, I guess, in contemporary society and the world today is, firstly, increase in secularism and personal piety, and the second, on the other hand, is in the midst of all the chaos that's going on, an increased amount of fundamentalism that's going on. Both of which are kind of like moving away from this objective. So how do you think, do you have any thoughts, wisdom, leadership on how we can turn that tide?
Leadership is his job, not mine. I would say, I think, again, Imran at the beginning mentioned I'm very optimistic and very hopeful. But I think in some ways, we all have a small part to play. And there are these vast tides of misunderstanding, these tendencies to secularism, these groups that claim to be the true religion that try to impose it on everyone else. All of these are vast movements that will continue long after I'm gone. But I think what is it that I can do and that I think many of us can do is simply to resist and say closed-mindedness is not spiritual. The radical sense of my religion is pure and simple is not true. That God is on our side only, you have no evidence for that. Your demonization of the other actually is a mistake because you don't actually know the other. And to insist, and by good example, obviously dialogue, cooperation, love of neighbor, working together, friendship is very important. But also to say, no matter what they say, I think it's a good thing for me to read Surah 19 of the Quran. I think it's a good thing for me, no matter who says what, that I can study Vaishnava Hinduism as a Roman Catholic, respecting the tradition and still being a Roman Catholic. So kind of to push back and say, even if it's a predominant flow toward exclusion of the other or vilification of the other or etc., that I don't agree. It's like in a world of violence, being nonviolent. That there's a certain sense of saying, if individuals among us insist on doing it the way we think is right, then the optimism is, in the long run, that will be more powerful than the waves of hatred and ignorance that catch the media title. So again, it's very hopeful, but I would say just discern what it is you need to do that is interreligiously right, and then do it no matter what they say. Easy to say, but I think it works out.
Wayne, it was the gentleman here. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the wonderful lecture that you had earlier, and also on the wonderful answering of the questions. I'm a Hindu. My name is Krishna, and my question is regarding this, the mystical poems, mystical texts that you were talking about. Oftentimes, the orthodoxy will find the mystical text to be against their ideas. And suppose I, as a Hindu, try to learn the mystical text of Islam or Christianity. Will the orthodoxy take it as a valid text, or will it be taken as correct interpretation of the particular religion? And I mean, will my understanding of Islam or Christianity from the perspectives of the mystic text will be taken as valid by the orthodoxy? So that is one question that I have. Second question is, I saw one of the books that you had was on Hindu gods and Christian god, I think something like that. So from a Hindu god perspective, what kind of Hindus have very, very diverse concepts of gods, from Advaitic to Dvaitic to Vishishtadvaita and all that. So what was your take on the Hindu god itself? I was just curious.
So two simple questions. Thank you very much. On the second one, book publishers want you to have a title that can be understood. So they want simple titles for complicated books. So that's the first thing, is that the Hindu god, Christian god, legitimately raised the question, well, which Hindu view of God? So basically, writing on only what I know something about, drawing on the Vedanta tradition of Ramanuja, some of the Shaiva Tamil texts of the Shaiva tradition, so certain kind of theistic Hinduism. In Nyaya and Vedanta in particular, then with some attention to the Tamil, focusing there. And I try to say at the beginning of the book, you could do this in other ways. And I don't mean to be saying all Christians think this way or all Hindus, this is what they believe. So it is complicated. And therefore, the title is simpler than the reality of the book, I think. So, and on the first question, which is very interesting, about how do mystical authors and mystical texts relate to the authority of their tradition? And I think sometimes there's a sense that, oh, that's a mystic, what we need to do is burn them at the stake, or lock them in prison like John of the Cross was locked in prison, or execute them because they're blasphemous. But I think that's probably an overdramatic simplification of how mysticism is honored in traditions. That although that happens, it can sometimes happen that way because the mystic is saying, I reject the rest of it. Who needs any of those rituals and priests and stuff? I reject all of that. Or the tradition is again cracking down and saying, if we have mystics, we won't be able to control them, so we have to stop it now. But in fact, figures I just mentioned, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Dionysius the Areopagite, Bernard of Clairvaux, Ignatius Loyola, all of these figures are actually deeply honored in Catholic tradition. And likewise to say, the Alvar saints of South India, the Shaiva Nayanmars of Tamil Nadu, Mirabai, Kabir, that some of these figures are deeply esteemed in the tradition. And I think, I'm not the one to point out, but in Islam, certain mystics who are highly honored by the tradition. It does make sense to say, instead of just picking a book from the library and saying, that's the true essence of the religion, see, is this a figure who's honored in the tradition over time? Because if you're just getting started in studying the mysticism of another tradition, rather than doing an esoteric thinker that no one has ever heard of, do someone like John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila will do well. And likewise, in terms of Hinduism, mystics who are honored by large numbers of people. But there still may be a sense of there's something about the mystic that the authority structure doesn't like, but the mystic is absolutely necessary. It's like saying you can have a body without breath. The body, which is the religion, needs the breath, which is the mystic.
Ibnu? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. My name is Ibnor, and I was actually very fortunate to be invited to the St. Mary of the Angels here in Singapore for a scriptural study. So they were discussing about the Gospel of Luke on the conception of Mary, and there was a point where they got stuck, right? And then I'm saying, wait, I think this story sounds familiar. It's somewhere in the Quran, right? So I went to my Quran and I flipped to the same story, and then we were comparing, and then they were like, oh, so that was what it was all trying to talk about, right? And based on that, we started to compare and really study the scripture side by side, and there were a lot of insights that we gained through that scriptural study. I'm quite curious in your journey studying the Hinduistic or Vedantic scriptures. Was there like a favorite story that kind of like informed you, that really kind of enlightened you about your own faith? And then my final question, since you're an expert in Hindu tradition, what are some of the most common misconceptions that we in the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam tend to have of Hinduism? I hope you could enlighten that for us.
Let's see if I remember it all. But on the first part, I think if you're saying that in this group you were in, beginning to read these different versions about Jesus and Mary and the birth of Jesus, that's a wonderful thing to do. So it's something I can do, and I bring it into class, reading the surah with students. Again, partly because I'm not an expert in Islam, making that point. But if you can do it with people of the two traditions together, without rushing to judgment and saying, I'm sorry, we can't come anymore because your tradition is so wrong. No, we can discuss, again, the powerful teachings of these texts and say, yes, there are those points where they seem to absolutely disagree, but that doesn't prevent us, the other 95%, from learning from one another. And if I read it myself, but then hear you speak about it, that could also open it up in a way that's very exciting. So I think that's really important. What was the second point again?
Your favorite story. Your favorite story in the Hindu tradition that informed you.
The impression of?
The Abrahamic faith.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that some Hindus, not present company, would have the view that the religions of the West are kind of very rigid and absolute and intolerant, and that they tend toward, you're all going to hell, you're all pagans, your religions are wrong, your religions are from the devil. Now there may be reasons due to missionaries who've come and said those very things, that we exclude yours, we're rigid. But I've tried over the years to say, well, actually, like Catholic views of other religions is actually more complicated. And therefore, the worst of our tradition, when we showed up and destroyed temples and so on, is not all of our tradition. But I think partly, the stereotype I have about your religion is not entirely fanciful, let's say, in any case. But I think it's a corrective to say, the fanciful view you had of the religion, let me explain to you why it's not the whole religion. So I think some Hindus have good reason for having very great suspicions about Christians and Muslims. But also, to leave it at that would be very sad, because there's actually much more learning that can take place if that's removed. And then the differences between, or the third one was about the Hindu.
Your favorite story in Hinduism that informed you about your own faith. Yeah. Do you have a favorite story?
I think, good question. If I go back and, the first, let me give you several examples. So the first book by a Hindu that I ever read was Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. And I was opened it up, and it was like moving to another planet. that these simple prayer songs by Tagore in that little book that won the Nobel Prize suddenly spoke to me universally. They crossed over across the boundaries and opened up for me that that's not a separate world from my world. These things are interconnected. And then secondly, just to give you an example, Sri Ramakrishna. So when I started reading the great master in the Gospel of Ramakrishna, this 19th century holy man who was a priest of the goddess Kali, who had these mystical experiences, even apart from the fact that he had experiences of Christ, was this powerful sense of a person totally given over to love of the divine. And somehow that spoke to me across religious differences, saying, look, how could you condemn Hinduism when it has somebody like Ramakrishna in it? So those are two examples of starting points that I had. A third and maybe very simple one would be Mahatma Gandhi. And I realize he's not like your 100% model Hindu. Some people, there are many ways of being Hindu. But when I read his autobiography, the story of his experiments with truth, and even before I saw the movie, that Gandhiji was a powerful witness to nonviolence, to truth, to seeing God in the eyes of the poor, and saying, well, if that's Hindu, then God bless Hindu, that there's something there that's universal and not foreign. So, those are the good examples. Back to the question earlier, what about the contrast and things that I didn't like? But I think it's important to have the positive starting points that motivate you to do this. And those are just some examples of how I got started.
On that note, as the moderator, I have the last question. Looking at comparative theology, Prof., as you discussed this morning in your lecture, it is a journey of somebody who is entrenched in his tradition, understands his tradition deeply, and then to understand the other tradition, and then come back to inform his tradition. It would appear that this is an exercise for really someone who is very committed. How, and not everybody can do that. How can the benefits of comparative theology flows into the wider society? If it helps to inform you and make you a better Catholic, how can that benefit also be sort of given to the rest of society who doesn't have your sense of discipline and commitment to want to study other traditions to inform your tradition?
Well, everyone should buy my books. What do you think? No, I think part of it is, I stressed several times I'm a teacher. So all my life I've been a teacher. I do write books and I do blog online and I do teach classes over and over, and I preach in the church on Sunday. I mean, different ways of expressing it and sharing it, with one's home community, but also trying to share the wisdom in a way that, don't write a book that nobody can read, or don't write a book that you have to have a PhD to read, but rather try to do writing that's accessible. When you talk to people, try to share with them. Like when I talk to people at the door of the church, and some of them know I was just in Asia or I was just in India, I try to explain in some ways what I was doing and why I, who just said the Mass, can also do this. So some kind of explanation. But also, at another level, as I was saying, you don't have to know the languages to do interreligious learning or do comparative theology. You don't have to have a PhD. You could have a full-time job. You could be learning this for the first time now. That any act of learning, a bit of study, every week you do a little bit of study, you get started slowly, is possible, and that there's no reason to say this is simply an elite thing. What I'm doing, the way we're talking about it, is pretty elite. So the professor who writes the books and studies the Sanskrit and so on. But that's a concentrated form of what I think we all can do. And anyone who ever asks me, is there something I can read, I'll get back to them and say, why don't you try this first? And if that doesn't work, then I can recommend something else. Or do you realize that there's a Hindu temple 2 miles from where you live? Go and see what it's like. And so you could start on different levels with people. So I hope that we find ways to communicate, to teach, to write in a way that's useful. Again, for younger people, do it on Facebook or other media. But to communicate it is part of our obligation. We have a privilege of learning and therefore a duty to share.
Thank you very much. So on that note, as we have heard for the last hour or so, is really about learning other tradition so that you can be more entrenched and deepen your understanding of your own tradition. And one takeaway for me tonight is the closed mind is not a religious person. You have to have an open mind to be a religious person. So can we put our hands together to thank Professor Clooney for a wonderful speech. I hand back to the MC.
Right, I don't want to prolong this event. I do know that Professor Francis is going to India. Have a safe journey and a smooth journey tomorrow. This is your first time in Singapore. Please do come here. We can't clone you yet. I would like to take this opportunity to thank officially our partners, and specifically Mr. Alami from the RSIS, Mr. Gerald from the ACCIRD, and not forgetting Mr. Rajaratnam, the CEO of Hindu Endowment Board, and of course my former colleague Liana Rosley from the Harmony Center. Please do look forward for more events under the Global Interfaith Leadership Series, and have a good weekend. Thank you.